had a stronger inkling, stronger sense that I would probably end up back in Asia rather than building a life in the long term in the US.
Meet Jonathan, born to a Malaysian father and a Korean mother in the US. He moved to Singapore as a child and is now a Singaporean citizen. Jonathan shared how it felt to renounce American citizenship for Singaporean, why code switching from Singlish to English is important, and whether there is self-censorship in Singapore's art scene. I'm Chernov, your Russian insider into immigrant life. Let's go!
There was a point in my family's lives when we would go through immigration and my dad would give him a stack of passports. And they were all, 5 different people of 4 different nationalities. And we always get confused looks from the immigration officers.
American, Korean, Malaysian, Singaporean.
Yes, that's correct. I grew up with a US passport and a Singapore PR. And then, enlisted into NS, first in my generation, actually. On both sides of the family.
You made the decision to give up your American passport after the NS.
Yes, that's correct.
Can you elaborate on that? How was it like?
Sure.
Yeah, what was your emotions?
The policy is that in between your 21st and 22nd birthday, if you hold on to a Singaporean passport and another passport, you have to make a decision within that time period. And if the period elapses and you haven't made a decision, the ICA can kind of unilaterally strip you of your Singaporean passport. And that's something that I know has happened to some people that I knew. But I was here and it was a hard decision for me because I had really grown up thinking of myself in many ways as an American growing up in Singapore, an Asian American growing up in Singapore. Even though the reality is that I'd spent most of my life here without equivalent amount of time in the US. And we would go back every year, go to Houston. On some occasions we go to New York. But I never had a very strong affinity with Houston either. I did not think of myself as Houstonian or Texan more specifically. So the identification was with a very hazy, big, abstract idea of being an American. And I think because that was something that I held to for a long time growing up, as a teenager, when the decision came for me to have to let go of that or to give that up. And I'm not to say that, it was especially traumatic or difficult, not trying to overstate that, it in any way, but some of those feelings of having to give up something that I held very close to me returned. And I had to come to grips with my own justifications for why I wanted to retain the Singaporean passport. On one hand, I did grow up here. On the other hand, I felt that, if my parents are going to be here for the long term and I wanted to be able to be close to them, look after them, then it was better to retain the Singaporean passport. The other thing was that, and I was 21 at the time, I didn't know what I was going to do for work, but I had a stronger inkling, stronger sense that I would probably end up back in Asia rather than building a life in the long term in the US. But I think ultimately it was a better decision for me, especially because after undergrad and grad school, I ended up taking a job and moving back here. Had I chosen to retain the US passport, it's not like they would have, swapped my Singaporean passport for a PR. I would have functionally just become a foreigner in Singapore, come back on a tourist visa, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that also felt like too drastic a decision to make at the time. But in a weird way, when I went back to the US for grad school, it was a kind of psychologically disorienting experience. So I was US born and grew up for a long time identifying as an American in certain ways, returning to the US on an F1 visa as an international student, which is psychologically interesting for me because in the US, no one questioned, everyone just assumed I was an American. And I had enough formative experiences in the US to be able to sound like I was an American as well. Familiarity with New York or with Houston or other parts of the US where my family had spent time in or were. And I think maybe that was also healing in a way. It made me think that I didn't have to take such a drastic stand in my mind that, I'm giving up all of my connections with being an American or any feelings that, is desirable to want to be American. I think it helped me just come to terms with the fact that there will always be a part of me that is American. I could recognize that without feeling shame or without feeling guilt in any way. And most of the time, in work settings, when I meet people for the first time, they'll ask me so what brought you to Singapore? Or when did you move here? And I had to be like, you know, moved here 27 years ago, I guess. I was one. And, you know, even sometimes when I meet with, you know, local organizations or even like government bodies, I get the question like, oh, so are you a local? And I'd be like, you know, I had to go for reservist in January, so I guess. So I think there's a part of me that it's still a little bit of distance maybe from what people might think of as like a real core, authentic Singaporean identity in a way. But I also think that the identity has grown expansive enough to accommodate people like me. And I'm sure, you know, over the course of the many interviews you've done for your channel, you're meeting people like me in a way who have strong connections to Singapore, even though sometimes it doesn't feel reciprocated.
I think the main identity feature is Singlish. I think that's what people distinguish you. Like people understand you're from here or not.
Yeah.
That's the main thing. That's what called like true blue Singaporean.
Yeah.
You say.
You know, understand all the words and phrases, being able to code switch.
Yeah,
I think so.
You don't have much Singlish accent.
Yeah.
It's like more neutral, maybe inclined to the US accent or like kind of neutral.
Yeah.
Can you switch to Singlish if you need to?
Yeah.
It's like in the army, probably need to be like fast, quick, and use Singlish.
Yeah. But I think Singlish, I think there's part of it that is intuitive to me just because of the fact that I grew up here, went through NS, it's just part of daily life.
Yeah.
Right? So I can code switch, you know, that's the parlance, that's the phrase that people like to use. And, you know, I think it comes up just in casual conversation with Singaporean friends. It's an interesting shared language, I think, that it is. You know, I think I saw in previous videos, some of your friends were mentioning, oh, even though everyone speaks English here, they speak it so fast, it's hard to catch.
Yeah.
And I think there's the pressure of efficiency and communication. And I don't know if it was mentioned in some of your earlier videos, but one of the sources of Singlish historically has been the army, because when people were first conscripted in the 1960s, this was before the effects of having English as a common medium for education really took root in Singaporean society. So you really had people who were coming from like, Hokkien speaking backgrounds, Tamil speaking backgrounds, Malay speaking backgrounds. And the commanders who were there were all, not orders, but they had to use English as the common medium of communication with everyone.
Yeah.
And so out of this pressure of like, everyone's kind of learning English at the same time, but their language bases are different languages. There was this kind of pressure that led to the evolution of Singlish in one form. The army was kind of a crucible for that. But even then, some of the slang that came out of the army is not really used anymore.
Do you think it's important for Singaporeans to be able to switch some more from Singlish to like more neutral English?
A lot of linguists have been doing research differentiating what they call Singapore Standard English from Singlish.
Yeah.
But there's this recognition that Singlish is its own distinctive and unique language. So it's almost kind of a bilingualism, being fluent in more Standard English and Singlish. So if you ask me honestly, I think it just depends on the kinds of roles that different people need to play in their everyday lives. Some people need to be able to speak Singlish for the jobs or the neighborhoods that they live in. Some people need to be able to at least have a grasp of Standard English and recognize the differences from Singlish. And, you know, I think, you know, and this is a different view from other views that Singlish is a degraded form of English, which I don't think is true. I think it's a different kind of language.
I don't think it's true either.
Yeah. So I think it's important to the extent that, you know, if people need it in their lives, you know, if, let's say, you know, Singapore's always trying to build out more service-oriented roles, public-facing roles, and tourism or other kinds of services, or those kinds of roles where you might be dealing with non-Singaporeans on a fairly regular basis. At least being able to have that grasp of Standard English is important, for example.
I don't know if you watched this video with the Russian girl, Elena. She was born in Singapore because her parents were sailors. So she ended up like being born in Singapore. And then I think she's like 25, 26, something like that, 27. So she spent all her life in Singapore, but she's on EP visa, employment pass. So not even PR. And this is an interesting case. So, and she speaks like more like an American because she went to CS, international school. And that's the cases are rare, and it's confusing for people, for other people, and it's confusing for like themselves. It's like, who am I? I all my life in Singapore, but I don't even have permanent residency. It's like that's the identity crisis.
I think the opacity of the process also creates I think it unnerves people a little bit, because you can apply for PR or apply for citizenship and get rejected without being told why. So it's a lot of guesswork as well in terms of like, oh, what are they looking for? And I think that also feeds into this feeling of like, oh, I'm not wanted or I don't belong in the way that I want to belong.
Do you have any parts of you which is Korean and Malaysian, or like Malay part, or like
Yeah.
from your mom and dad, or it's mostly like Singaporean plus American?
I think definitely actually quite strong on both sides. I still feel an affinity with Malaysia just from hearing the stories that my grandparents would tell me, of their lives living there in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, life under the Japanese occupation and the reasons why they decided to leave. And my dad was born in KL and he still has formative memories in KL and he goes back for work fairly frequently. On my mom's side, I think the identification with being Korean has always been very strong. She feels it very strongly, even though she grew up outside of Korea, but she returned to Korea. Another nice thing about being in Singapore is that it's close enough to both countries. My dad goes in and out of Malaysia for work. My mom goes in and out of South Korea for work as well. And so, growing up, a lot of visits to Korea. I will say is another interesting thing growing up at the time when K-pop and Korean dramas became very popular. My mom grew up in a time when the perception of Korea, this is back in the 80s, was a little bit like how people think of Vietnam now. Emerging market, developing economy, because my mom growing up in Hong Kong, a lot of her friends, they went to the US or the UK for college and she was like, oh, I'm going to Korea for college. And that association was kind of tantamount to like someone now saying, oh, I'm going to Vietnam for undergrad. Which was like unconventional. There's maybe not condescension per se, but it was like not desirable maybe at the time. And then you had this entire transformation in perception that came in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis, actually post-1997. I think that was one of the catalysts for the Korean government to begin investing more in entertainment, music, television, the fruits of which you really saw with the explosion in popularity of there's this Korean drama called Winter Sonata that became very popular, first in Japan, and it spread throughout Southeast Asia and the rest of Asia. This was like in the 2000s. And then, of course, when the first K-pop groups, really I would argue, very commercial, mass market K-pop groups crossed over and really broke out in the mid-2000s and 2010s. So I was in secondary school when all of a sudden, I went to an all-boys school. I was at Anglo-Chinese School Independent. When my seniors, they all began changing their profile pictures to their favorite members of Girls' Generation or, different groups. And all of a sudden, there was a certain cultural capital, I would say, that came with being Korean, which was very weird to me. So, people were listening to Korean music and consuming Korean dramas, and they all wanted to visit Korea and they wanted to eat Korean food. And I think this is an experience maybe shared by members of the Korean diaspora around the world. Maybe it's a little bit more drastic, let's say, for Korean communities in the US where, let's say you grew up in a majority white community and people made fun of you for the food that you brought, like your kimchi or your japchae, because they said it was smelly or something. I think that level of ostracization is maybe not as strong as Singapore, but I still remember the shift where all of a sudden Korea had this allure. It was cool. People were interested. And that's only grown, in an extraordinary kind of astronomical way, with Gangnam Style in 2012. That happened when I was also in secondary school. When BTS really exploded, BTS and Blackpink really exploded in popularity. Of course, for the Korean government, they've reaped the rewards of that handsomely. People are open to working with Korean investors or Korean businesses, or they get lots of tourism, lots of foreigners wanting to come to Korea. But I think, those I would say are just maybe more of the superficial aspects. I think, ironically or not, my mother tongue actually is Korean. Even though when I went to school here, my mother tongue was Chinese, but really my mother tongue is Korean. So I still feel a lot of affection, when I hear Korean, even though I'm not fluent. It's the language that my grandma speaks primarily. So I speak a little bit of Korean when I talk to her. And it's one of those languages that ties the family, even though we're all far apart. It's one of my regrets, maybe. My parents did send me to Korean school, or my mom sent me to Korean school when I was a kid. Again, I'm sure you've heard this a lot already, but local school is pretty stressful. It was extra school on top of that, and it didn't really stick so much. And we didn't speak a lot of Korean when I was growing up at home, partially because my dad never learned it. So I think in those formative years when I could have developed some fluency in Korean, that didn't happen, and a little bit of a regret. So started taking Korean lessons a couple of years ago and now still try to learn a bit more every day just because it's a language that I have a bit of affinity with.
By the way, guys, if you wanna start working remotely, one of the options is to start your own YouTube channel. And I prepared for you a PDF guide how to make your first $1,000 from your YouTube channel. Okay, if you want this guide, it's for free. There's the link in the description. Go get it. And now back to the video.
I'm quite involved in Singapore's literary community. So I started writing poetry when I was in primary school, actually. Even though it was hard, a lot of challenging new experiences to process and a lot of questions about identity, actually, because I'm in Singapore for these 2 years. I'm serving in the Singaporean military, trying to think about setting a meaningful example for my brothers who would have to do it, but also being the only person in my family on both sides having to do it. So those kinds of questions were very much on my mind. So poetry emerged as a primary literary medium by which I was engaging with a lot of these ideas. And I was also approached, and it's funny, after all of these conversations about whether my affinity with Singapore, proximity to feeling Singaporean, I took on a role as a managing editor for this website called poetry.sg, which is set up to be an archive or a one-stop kind of destination for people interested in poetry written by Singaporean or Singapore-related writers in English, in Malay, in Chinese, and working on building out sections for Tamil poets, poets writing in Tamil. So I'm involved there, editing, proofreading, commissioning, building a pipeline for essays to be published. So that's these are the two worlds I've come to inhabit since moving back to Singapore.
Does it feel like the scene, poetry scene, literature in general, it's niche, like too niche in Singapore? Because I'm from Russia, the literature and poetry is is huge.
Yeah.
Like from childhood, we have all this poets, and then there are lots of people who are interested in the topic. There are numerous of clubs and perform different. In the UK, it's kind of the same.
Yeah.
But in Singapore, it feels like a bit too niche. People are more, as you said, Singaporean students, they go to law school, to finance, probably doctors. But how would you compare Singapore art scene, but specifically poetry and literature scene compared to UK, let's say?
I think it's not mainstream for sure, but at the same time, I feel like poetry is not necessarily mainstreamed in many cultures around the world, even though maybe for countries where there is a stronger understanding of a tradition of poetry, then the kids might grow up learning and reciting it. So, very strong classical Chinese poetry tradition in China, of course in Russia, in India, for example, Tamil Nadu, the Kurals, which are Tamil, kind of genre of Tamil poetry. Everyone kind of has them in their bones and they'll recite them on the day-to-day. That kind of culture is not really present in Singapore. Even the local secondary schools, the local syllabi, for a long time they're mostly teaching British and American literatures for the English classes, but the representation of Singaporean authors was not very high until the last couple of years, where the Ministry of Education decided, we want to now strive for a balance because we have a lot of good local writers. Let's, maybe half and half it, so at least there's proportional representation. So I think, the next generation of kids will be growing up reading books in English by Singaporean writers about Singapore, about Singaporean experiences, Singaporean subjects, which maybe will be a little bit different from previous generations who are, schooled in British literature, for example. And I think the hope for mainstreaming is a strong one, because mainstreaming will also mean, and this is not the reason why people write, but it helps, which is commerciality, helping the local publishing houses sell enough books to keep going and to be able to publish and support local authors. But it's been very difficult. Government's National Arts Council, which is a stat board under Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth, they do support authors in some ways as well. Though I will say the other thing is that the writers of Singapore have had it a little rough over the years because of battles with government censorship. We've always been very strong, especially narratives that have been critical of the government. Poetry, theater, novels. A famous example is a graphic novel called The Art of Charlie Chan Hock Chai. Like a graphic novel, told in comic form. It had received funding from the National Arts Council, but the book presents an alternative view of what would have happened if Lee Kuan Yew never became the prime minister. And Lim Chin-seong, who is another historical figure, was part of the PAP, then broke away, and he was detained in jail in the 60s.
Yeah.
But if he became the prime minister instead? Initially, that book received funding from the government, and then they withdrew it, even though they were already quite far into the process of publishing it. So this has been another challenge for writers in Singapore, trying to figure out what are the boundaries, what am I allowed to, what can I say and what can I not say? And it's kind of always that challenge of being very careful with managing that.
What are the other non-known topics, like apart of the being critical to the government?
If there's anything that is perceived as being offensive to any ethnic, racial groups or any religions, and this is not just for literature, but you see it broadly. For example, recently, it's kind of funny, there's this Korean DJ who wears the robes of a Buddhist monk, and he'll incorporate Buddhist chants into his sets when he's DJing. The Singaporean government didn't give him a license to perform in Singapore because they sensed and decided, we think that this will be offensive to the Buddhist community. So those kinds of questions typically are seen as sensitive. Questions.
Like sex, LGBTQ, not
I think
really.
Not so much anymore. Maybe 20, 30 years ago, when that was still very much a taboo topic. Now I think that's changing a little bit. I think, more conservative sections in Singapore will still feel very uncomfortable with it, but I don't think that you'll not be allowed to publish in Singapore because of that. But definitely race, religion. I think narratives that are too critical of the conventional Singapore story that are being pushed out. But even then, I think there is generally a fairly high tolerance for alternative kinds of visions of Singapore. So for example, Charlie Chan Hock Chai, even though the government funding was withdrawn, can still buy it in Singapore, for example. And there are lots of novels about, let's say, from the viewpoint of the student activists who were supporting the communists in the 60s and 70s. There are those kinds of novels that you can purchase as well. Definitely race, religion, questioning certain kinds of state narratives. Those kinds of topics for a long time have been kind of beyond the boundaries of what you can talk about and what you can't talk about.
Drugs?
Oh yeah, drugs for sure. Actually maybe capital punishment. If you're too critical of capital punishment, because they've got the death penalty still here. So that is still something that the government is sensitive about. Nowadays, the mistreatment of migrant workers actually is something that they're sensitive about as well. And sometimes, criticism of Singapore's political economic model. So you see, The Economist might put out a piece criticizing it, and the UK High Commissioner writes an angry response. Or the New York Times has something criticizing Singapore, then the Singaporean ambassador will write an angry response. There are some topics that the government is still a bit touchy about.
So for the writers, they're kind of trying to find the boundaries here. How to be still creative and trying to express themselves, but not to get themselves in trouble.
I mean...
Playing with the rules, bending the rules a little.
Yeah, exactly. I think the sad thing is that because this culture or this environment of censorship has been present in Singapore for so long, most people have learned how to self-censor. So you don't even need to be told what's out of bounds, but you'll be writing something, you'll be like, maybe this, I won't be able to get published because of this or because of that.
It's actually, that's true, because when I started this channel, a couple of years ago, one of the ideas was to interview gay people in Singapore, LGBTQ people in Singapore. And I asked my friends, international Singaporeans as well, is it okay if I just talk to people the gay people? Most of them say no, you don't want it. If you talk to them, you'll be sent out of the country. And I still decided to go for it. So I published this intro, did this video.
It
was fine, completely fine. I didn't have any, I don't know, maybe I will be sent out of the country soon, but
I hope not.
No, but I think people really, this self-censorship, people are so used to it, and some people think of Singapore in terms of the censorship Singapore much stricter than it is in reality. Singapore, you need to be careful with the stuff, but still then there are gray zones. But it's not like some other countries. We would not name them here, but Singapore is fine, I think.
Yeah.
To some extent, yeah. Jobs are starting.
New prime minister. I think they are inching toward maybe a more open, consultative, discursive kind of culture versus the early generations where it was very, very like, you do what I say kind of feeling. Especially as levels of education continued to increase, people are, the proportion of university educated folks in Singapore is growing year by year. And people will grow less tolerant of being told what to do, what you can say or what you can't say, what's allowed or what's not allowed. So that's going to register in how the political culture changes as well. Now people are not just going to comply if the government says this is the best policy for you. People are going to want to push back, question why, what are the rationalizations, what are the considerations behind why you're pushing out this policy. Let's have a debate about it versus, oh, okay, we'll just accept it and, if we're not happy with it, then we'll try and vote you out in the next election, that kind of thing.
I think Singapore government, are very hands-on on what people think and what people feel. They really, I think, they test the grounds what they can push for. And that's a smart way. That's what politicians should do, actually.
Yeah, I think so. Keep an ear close to the people who will be most affected by the policies. Are, a lot of the time, that's like the low-income groups who have to be reliant on government services, much more maybe than others. And, the thing about Singapore is that they love to do closed-door discussions for sensitive topics. And I think this is something that was brought up by some of your interviewees that have had some of these high-level discussions with Singaporean officials, which is that, when it's a closed-door kind of setting, you can say all kinds of things that you want, but they're very careful in how they manage what goes public in terms of the image, in terms of the messaging, in terms of, sensitive topics.
What's your one main principle in life that you kind of developed through your life and career, your NS years, the study years? Something really important for you.
Service, compassion, and empathy. Some of that comes out from the fact that, just comes out from my Christian faith. I believe that, we are here not to be served, but to serve other people. Meaning that, we are willing to give of our time and of our effort and our attention to support others in need, to be, encouraging presences in the lives of others. And I think that comes very much out of my faith. But then, empathy and compassion, and especially in a place like Singapore where there's so many differences, different life stories, different life trajectories, different, ways that we grew up, different customs, different cultures, and especially, different socioeconomic backgrounds, which always been quite sensitive, quite difficult in Singapore. So I think, to think about, and again, maybe that's something that the government gets sensitive about because, you talk about the income inequality or the Gini coefficient and they'll be like, oh, but, low levels of homelessness and this and that. And, it's a thing where, even though Singapore does very well in many ways, there are always ways that things can be done better. And I do think, thinking about income inequality, this treatment of migrant workers, better support for the marginalized communities is always something that I care a lot about deeply. So service, empathy, compassion.
What's the meaning of life?
To give it the overtly religious dimension is to love God and love people. And a less religious dimension would be to love and serve people. I think that's always been something that I've been thinking about. To go back to NS, that was really when I had to learn in a very painful way the meaning of sacrifice. Because NS is not just, about learning to perform a particular function in the military or the police or in the civil defense force, but really learning about what it means to give up, something that's important to you, your time, opportunity to earn an income, education, in service of something that's greater than yourself. And it's a hard lesson to learn, but I think it's something that I was glad to learn as well.
Cool. Thanks so much, man.
Yeah, no.
Thank you.